I'm sure at one point in your life, you've called someone a psychopath. Whether that was your ex-girlfriend in some big end-of-the-relationship argument, or the dude who cut you in line at the Chick-fil-A drive-thru, I'd be willing to put money on it. But do we even know what this means? Like, sure, it means crazy person in the most rudimentary sense of the word. But like, officially, do we know what this means? And more importantly, this is part of my grade, is Meursault from Albert Camus's... whatever. The Stranger, a psychopath or a sociopath? Well, according to Amy Morin, a respected psychotherapist, the term psychopath is used to describe someone who is callous, unemotional, and morally depraved. Now right away, you might recognize the word unemotional and make up your mind that Meursault is in fact a psychopath. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Now a sociopath is described as someone who is deceitful, manipulative, and uncaring. Now the most important trait from that would be uncaring, which we know Meursault to be as well. So which one is it? While researching the difference between the two, I honestly came to the conclusion that Meursault is a sociopath. While there may be a lot to argue that he's a psychopath, what really set me off was that a psychopath was described as being intelligent, charming, and good at mimicking emotions, all of which Meursault is not. To add to that, they were also described as being able to pretend like they're interested in you, but in reality they probably don't care. If you recall from the book, Meursault was absolutely dreadful at mimicking emotions. I mean, he can't even pretend to be upset at his own mother's funeral.
Mom had died today, or yesterday maybe, I don't know.
A psychopath would have been able to shed some crocodile tears and blend in with the crowd, but that wasn't the case at all. Meursault stuck out like a sore thumb, considering the fact that he even fell asleep during the funeral. He shows little interest in his mother's death, and as the book goes on, he retains this trait no matter how dire the circumstances become. Sociopaths are also described as having a conscience, but it being very weak. And while I do believe Meursault does have a conscience, I agree that it is just almost non-existent. He has the power to prevent some serious conflict, like with Raymond, but he just doesn't care enough to stop it, or at the very least put in any real effort into stopping it.
He asked if I thought she was cheating on him, and it seemed to me she was. If I thought she should be punished, and what I would do in his place. And I said you can't ever be sure, but I understood his wanting to punish her.
What stood out to me the most was that the article described sociopaths as having the potential to be violent, but never really looking for trouble. I suppose a good way to prove how psychopaths are violent would be something like the movie Psycho, in which Norman Bates acts extremely violent by stabbing a woman to death in the shower in possibly one of the most iconic scenes in cinema, but I digress. Unless provoked, Meursault isn't really shown to be violent at all, except when he kills the Arab on the beach, and while some may argue that he was looking for trouble, again, I disagree. Meursault left the bungalow after Raymond and him went back because he was looking for shade and isolation, or at least he claims so. And I believe this testimony because Meursault never struck me as a liar, and even if he was, he wouldn't lie even when his life depended on it.
Without working up to it, he asked if I loved Maman. I said yes, the same as anyone. And the clerk, who up to then had been typing steadily, must have hit the wrong key because he lost his place and had to go back.
In the second half of the book, he tells the magistrate that he cannot lie about how much he loves his mother, nor his faith in God. Both of these points would greatly impact his trial, as it seemed as if that's what the prosecutor used against him to prove that he has no remorse in his body at all. His lawyer even tried to manipulate his words to say that he wasn't feeling himself the day of the funeral to explain how he just didn't feel any sadness about his mother's death, but Meursault insisted that he should not lie. And perhaps you might disagree and say that in a social setting he might lie, but you'd be wrong there too. He isn't afraid to be brutally honest when talking to others either. Now, one of the main traits I want to point out for a sociopath is that they lack empathy and have a desire to exploit others, and you can definitely say he did that with Marie. Now, some might say that she changed her for the better, but based on the ending of the book, I personally feel like he just used her for her body and just gave in to his own male tendencies.
She just wanted to know if I would have accepted the same proposal from another woman with whom I was involved with in the same way. I said sure.
And going back to the trait of not being able to pick up on social cues, he just simply cannot blend into a conversation he finds boring or uninteresting, or at the very least is able to exploit for his own personal gain, like Marie.
At that point I yawned, and the old man said he'd be going. I told him that he could stay, and that I was sorry about what had happened to his dog.
Now, why I find this quote to be such a great example is because it shows both his lack of empathy and interest in others. While Solomano did mistreat his dog, he was pretty much weeping at that point, and Marcel couldn't do much more than just yawn in his face, which, if you ask me, is pretty disrespectful. In conclusion, I would argue that Marcel is most definitely a sociopath compared to a psychopath. Marcel isn't necessarily a bad guy, he just doesn't play along with societal standards. Caring for your mother is something that is expected by everyone, except for maybe a small minority, depending on the circumstances they grew up with, but because he doesn't show a deep caring for her, everyone is disgusted by him. Now, I hate to be that guy, but I think this does say something about our society. No one really understands Marcel's complex, and perhaps he doesn't either. And you could argue that he was put to death simply because of the fact that he killed someone, but I would argue to say that he got the death penalty because no one understood his lack of remorse. It's not like he had a violent past or previous arrests, and a good chunk of his trial was just spent pointing out his lack of emotions and remorse, and most importantly, his just disregard for his mother's death. His lack of remorse may lead you to believe that he's a danger to society, but I think that only proves my point. The man who does not play the game is destined to fail.